LCTR here, and I got Shatterline completely wrong. I thought I knew what sort of game it was after playing for a few hours, but actually, taking a proper tour of the available game modes changed my impression from something like a Call of Duty mixed with some Dirty Bomb style game modes, and I actually left finding the gameplay more like Destiny. Yeah, Shatterline is an active development beta game. It's free to play, but there are also some monetization options, so I'll leave it to you to decide how released that actually makes the game. So stick around and we'll have a look at the gameplay, the maps, the modes, the customization and the monetization. We'll answer that all-important question, is it worth playing? And if you do like games like these, but perhaps don't have time to check them all out, then please do tap that subscribe button. Not only really helps me support making these videos, but it also means that whenever I check another out, I can help you stay informed of those new titles and updates to others. First impressions of Shatterline are good. The menu UI is decent, and even the character assets are well made. That extends to the actual game too. Needing to select the PvP mode is your first clue of how the game views itself, but that's the route I took first. The available options for PvP seem to change fairly regularly, but things like Team Deathmatch, Conquest, and most like my beloved Dirty Bomb and Escort mode too. In addition, we seem to have some other rotation of modes, such as one called Barricade, where there's a setup phase where players sculpt the map that it's then played on, or at least that's what it says in the description. Despite queuing for that mode for a bunch of times, I never actually got to play it, so modes like TDM and Conquest seem to be much more popular. The gunplay is reminiscent of something like Call of Duty, real focus on aim down sights rather than hipfire, which seems pretty inaccurate regardless of setup. Time to kill is also pretty short, especially if headshots are involved. It's not quite COD fast though. 4 actual PvP modes, all 6v6, Team Deathmatch and Conquest feel pretty much exactly as you might imagine. That's a ponderous thing for me, as both modes make me rage more than any other game in recent memory. And against experienced teams, the experience is kind of like getting your hand accidentally caught in industrial machinery. I think with age has come a lack of patience for less structured game modes. If I die to someone who spawned behind me, then I'm pretty much over the whole thing immediately. I played a lot of these modes when Quake and UT were in their prime. I wish these modes weren't as popular these days, as there are so many more preferable options. It'll surprise no long-term subscriber of the channel to know that the mode which is most like Dirty Bomb, the Escort mode, is my favourite. That common focus for the teams takes much of the randomness out of the experience and adds an extra layer of tactics that those other RNG modes kind of miss. For all the decent polish and plethora of options, one feeling I kept coming back to was the feeling of some of these options are made a little shallow with lack of content for that specific mode. And for Escort mode, this means that there's just one map to play. As this is a beta, I got the feeling that perhaps the devs are metaphorically throwing options at the player base and seeing what sticks, perhaps. Clearly there's finite time and finite resources, so I hope modes like Escort get the attention they deserve. And honestly, I think the game thrives with more structure. The characters all have individual abilities too, for more DPS-focused options, snipers, grenade launchers, tankier armored choices, and more support roles with healing and revive bot skills. These abilities are core to the gameplay. Most frags are with normal weapons, but for example, your super-powered ultimate ability sniper can be wielded multiple times during a match. The weapons are available to all characters, but they are split into tiers that you unlock as you play the game. There are assault rifle, SMG, shotgun, sniper, and pistol sidearms. Each of these have options for each tier and have a battle pass-like progression where individual customization can be applied to the weapon. Scope options, grips, magazine, and so on, buff and debuff stats such as, say, stability, reload speed, and so on. This does mean that for new players, you wander into a world where you don't know the maps well, and you're also perhaps using weapons that aren't performing as well as more experienced players. With a matchmaking system that doesn't seem to mind putting new players against highly skilled regulars, well, I had some pretty rough early games. That is a bit of a concern for the new player experience. There are also weapon modifications. These are crafted at random and add an additional stat and visual variation. The one I made for an SMG gives an animated flame effect and 10% more weak spot damage, aka headshot damage. There's some other innovation too, mainly in the form of movable objects in the levels. You manhandle these by kicking them around to form extra cover or as useful objects to climb to reach higher vantage spots. And as an added bit of spice, you can even kill enemies by knocking these movable objects into them. On the whole, these movables feel pretty useful and actually impactful to the general gameplay, feel like a good addition. On the Escort map, these movables also appear as vehicles, which makes them read a lot better than the generic cubes that feature in other locations. And as I've said, this is beta, so there are some bugs with these movables too. Sometimes the physics of them glitches out when they impact together or snag with other objects. They also don't seem to sync properly with that play of the game movement that happens at the end of matches. They seem to just reset back to their default positions or become invisible entirely. My main error in understanding what Shatterline brings to the table was to discount the PvE modes as being some second-class citizen to the PvP. The experience of playing couldn't be further from the truth. What I was expecting was the same maps as PvP with some wave defense element and something along those lines. What I actually found was massively different in scope. The PvP maps I'd seen were basically just a small slice of the larger world that the PvE gameplay uses. The story mode is unsurprisingly telling the backstory of the world of Shatterline. You fight AI enemies through some really quite diverse locations compared to the PvP side. The city sections felt familiar, but then you find the game twisting and turning through streets, beneath massive domes and into churches for more trial-like encounters. There was what seemed like makeshift scientific bases before finding more haunting scenes with what looked like petrified enemies. The whole thing culminated in a large boss battle in an arena. But by the time I'd reached that stage, I was getting more flashbacks of Destiny 2's instance dungeons than anything else. This isn't what I expected from a smaller new development studio. However, in hindsight, this wasn't even the game showing its full hand. Not long after first trying the PvE modes, they were rotated again, and for the first time a roguelike option was made available. And again, this constant cycling of content kind of does feel like the developers perhaps testing out what really chimes with the player base. The PvE modes have custom animated intros, voice acting, and other finery you might not expect too. But the roguelike mode certainly took the biscuit for re-evaluating the scale of the world the game wants to inhabit. Gone were the city streets and urban landscapes. We arrive in what reminded me of the landscape from Death Stranding, perhaps? A huge expanse of wilderness, perhaps something Scandinavian in style somehow, maybe a bit of Iceland too, with the dark volcanic-looking ground. My two teammates and myself, and PvE always seems to be teams of 3 at the moment, run through large distances to complete encounters with enemies and unlock rewards. It's new weapons or buffs to help you continue to progress through the world and finish increasingly difficult trials. On the whole, it was just way more fun than I expected it being. And in fact, the whole process of leveling weapons to unlock attachments and then even further tiers, the PvE mode with their many enemies, it felt like a much quicker way to progress through that system. It also helped to give meaning and progression to playing the PvE mode. And after all, unlike Destiny, this game doesn't have loot drops to keep you playing content. And although some of the PvE maps felt massively different in scale and scope to the PvP arenas, the whole thing still felt cohesive and part of the same world somehow. It didn't elicit that feeling that you sometimes get in some games, where some of the maps feel like they're somehow imported from another title. From being a PvP game with some PvE options in my mind, Shatterline suddenly felt like a PvE game with some PvP options, and it gave me hope and interest to what the devs want to build this game into for and post-release. On graphics, Shatterline delivers almost universally high-quality results. You might spot some issues, again, this is beta software, but the assets for both first and third-person models and textures are exactly what you'd want in a title in 2022. And even when the scale of the environment stretches out to the horizon with alien-looking landscapes, Shatterline manages to maintain that fidelity. On the performance side, things ran pretty well on my fairly recent system. There were moments when performance did drop, but honestly, that felt more like a bug of some kind rather than a general lack of performance. On the whole, I had no issue keeping the game in that gaming monitor refresh rate sort of territory. For customization, on top of the weapon leveling and assorted unlocks, there's also a pretty comprehensive range of cosmetic options, some paid and others unlockable via gameplay. There's some pretty granular control too, with character hair, face, head, jacket, and so on can be unlocked and changed. In addition, there are whole-scale character-changing skins available in the store, although those do seem to be only available with real money. There does seem a little way to go to fully flesh out these options though. Not every character will have options for all these categories. And in addition, and this applies to the weapon skins too, there doesn't seem to be a way to preview the effect of some of those cosmetic options. And furthermore, it isn't often clear what you need to do to unlock a specific cosmetic, even if you do see it in those list of options. I think for a free-to-play title especially, some of these user experience rough edges need some rounding over before the game pushes for full release. I'd say at the moment, the monetization of the game would suffer because of it. Player numbers seem pretty stable, with midweek peak concurrent users of about 1,500 players, and obviously more on weekends. It means that if you're playing at a weird time for your region, you might have to matchmake into another region to find a game in a decent timescale, but I never actually failed to get a game when I tried. This is all pre-release as well. I'd certainly hope with some advertising, especially pushing how much content and scope the game has, we'll be looking at a larger player base, and also keep in mind, this title has only been on Steam since September of this year. Shatterline, is it worth playing? I'm happy to have my initial impressions, well, shattered by finding out how much more content the game has than just the PvP modes I initially tried. The core gameplay is decent, there's some movement finessing that I'd like to see happening to make things feel a little bit more fluid, but the gunplay and content we have in this beta is impressive for a new studio. The PvP and PvE modes mark the game out as having higher ambitions than you might first give Shatterline credit for. So I'm happy to recommend that people check out this interesting new addition to the FPS landscape, especially as this is a free-to-play title. There are beta issues, of course. I did experience some stability problems from one release that thankfully seems to be remedied in the most recent patch. Other things like in-game chat, both voice and text, really need to be included, especially when the PvE game matchmake you with other players which you then have limited means to communicate with. Some areas that other games underdevelop, like giving user feedback on progression, are already well done by Shatterline. The post-match screen showing your progression on the daily and weekly missions turns over pleasantly, and your unlocks, badges and other progress is shown in a way that gives you a sense of achievement and advancing. There is, however, that whole feeling of thin or trial content for some of the game modes. Things like that roguelike PvE mode felt pretty fleshed out, a large world, it worked well, decent amount of replayability, but for something like the Escort PvP mode, there's one map, and I'd say that it has some balance issues for attackers who can easily get stalled if the defense pushes up quickly. When the map progresses, there's a lot to enjoy in that mode, and as I mentioned before, the game really works well with that more objective-based game mode, but it really is just one map at the moment, so I'm left wondering, with limited time and resources, which of these many modes will make it through to the final game. I'd personally trim the PvP modes down to 3 major options, as with the huge amount of effort that the huge PvE modes and maps must consume, I wonder how much content the individual modes will actually get. If, for example, a player only likes PvP or PvE, will they find enough to keep them around and investing in the game? Well, that's the sort of question that only time will know the answer to. I'm certainly going to be keeping Shatterline installed and my eyes peeled for updates, and hopefully a final release in the coming months. What do you think of Shatterline? You looking for a new FPS to try out? Let me know all your powerful thoughts and feelings by leaving a comment below right now. Like always, I'll be reading every single one of them. Yes, even yours. If you don't have time to check out all these new titles that pop up, then please do tap the subscribe button and support the channel. That way I'll help you keep up to date with all the fresh options. Thank you all for your support, and thank you so much for watching. I'll see you next time. Take care.